reopened for business, just on the exterior part here in Paris. Clovis Casali is outside the Musée de la Monnaie in Paris, and we can go across to him. And now, Clovis, what protocols have been put in place where you are?
Well, the Musée de la Monnaie in Paris, here on the banks of the Seine, has reopened, but it's all but business as usual. If you want to go and see an exhibition on Smurfs taking place here, well, you have to book beforehand. This has been done, of course, to limit the number of visitors. Only 30 visitors per hour. Of course, face masks are mandatory, and curators of the exhibitions here have made sure that there's a very strict path to take for visitors. This in order to avoid as much interaction as possible. You have smaller museums here in France that have already reopened, while the bigger ones, such as the Musée d'Orsay, the famous museum of all the Impressionist masterpieces, just a few hundred meters down the banks of the Seine, the old railway station of the Musée d'Orsay hasn't reopened yet. That will take place on June 23rd. And here, of course, you've got probably the most famous museum in the world, the Louvre. The Louvre will only reopen on July 6th. For these big museums, it's essential, crucial to be ready to welcome visitors and ensure the utmost safety. As you can imagine, these museums are extremely big. They welcome huge numbers of visitors, so they need to make sure that the organization is perfect in order to prevent any risks in these days of COVID-19.
Clovis, the small-scale museums are reopening for business, and then large-scale museums, as you said, will be opening in the weeks to come. How are they managing not having tourists? Because museums depend on foreign tourists for funding, essentially.
Indeed, tourism is crucial for France. It represents 7% or so of the country's GDP. It's the most visited country in the world, nearly 90 million visitors last year. And of course, not everyone comes here for museums, but culture, French culture, is very much one of the points that attracts visitors from around the world. Take the Musée du Louvre, the most visited museum in the world. It attracted 10 million visitors last year, and that brings in money, but also brings in money for the local businesses. And it's been a very tough year for local businesses. 2020 will not go down in history as a good year for French businesses, and as a matter of fact, for businesses around the world. As we said earlier, these big museums are reopening a bit later because they need to be extremely ready and have the perfect organization when they welcome these visitors in order to implement all these safety measures, and it does take time. So I can tell you, we've contacted some people at the Louvre Museum. They're working around the clock to be ready in time. And also, why should they open straight away? Because the borders around the world are closed down, of course. In Europe, countries are expected to reopen their borders around mid-June. That hasn't happened yet. But museums anyway, in France, and businesses in general, are expecting this summer to be a summer where they will welcome not necessarily tourists from abroad, but moreover tourists from around France.
Clovis, thank you very much for that. Clovis Casali reporting there from central Paris with the Louvre in the background, which will be opening in the weeks to come. Now, for more on how the government in France